Right, let's continue and resume with our special topics on research ethics. Last time we talked about federal regulations and IRB, um, and we're about to get to the details of assessing components of a research project in relation to all ethical considerations. So, this particular topic, a short one, is about how to assess risks. I should say though, identifying risks in a potential research project is actually a very technical and specialized job. It requires quite a bit of experience from the reviewer's perspective in actually conducting research. So that's why the IRB board, Institutional Review Board, um, typically consists of professors, active researchers from different departments of a university. So, for example, from my knowledge, my limited contact with the IRB board of UH, the board consists of psychologists, sociologists, biologists, and at one point, I think professors from this particular department too. Um, so many of the techniques or judgments when IRB members are assessing risks can really not be taught exactly because it requires hands-on experiences in research from the reviewer's perspective. So that's why in this particular module we're only going to focus on one particular risk that's quite, I think, apparent to anyone that has even very limited knowledge or exposure to research, and that's the unauthorized or inadvertent disclosure of individually identifiable information. Um, be cautious though, even though this is a risk, right? So um, the disclosure of individually identifiable information, even though this is a risk, it does not mean that research or researchers are not allowed to collect such information. Researchers definitely can be allowed to collect this information. It's just that when researchers are collecting or proposing to collect this information, they have to be very, very careful. They have to they have to first of all make a very strong argument for the reason or reasons to collect all this information. And second, they have to propose a very concrete um, and realistic procedures or plans to manage and protect such information. And they have to make sort of a pledge that they would not, disclose such information unless they have consent from particular research projects. Um, Another thing to bear in mind is that this risk, the unauthorized disclosure of individually identifiable information, depends on how sensitive data are. Um, you know, some data are, even though they're individually identifiable, for example, a person's biological sex, a person's um, legal name, or person's age, of course, they're individually identifiable, or a person's educational background. Um, that information, is not really very sensitive. Well, some people consider age a very sensitive piece of information. That's fine, but usually they're not very very sensitive. But there are some data that are a lot more sensitive than that. For example, the use of illegal drug use. Um, Many research projects, especially on research on, criminology or sociology, and even sometimes COMG studies, they do ask people about their illegal drug use. So from a research perspective, that question is totally legit. Depending on the purpose of the study, researchers definitely um, you know can propose to ask such a question. Uh, but the real issue is, what will happen after researchers collect such information from participants, given that participants provide truthful answers. That is, participants do not lie about their illegal drug use. So this data, or this kinds of data, are very sensitive because they have legal consequences. Because if such information is leaked with other information that can pinpoint subjects, for example, their name, their postal code, their physical address, right? Imagine that this information about their illegal drug use, coupled with their name or other individually identifiable information, can actually brought legal, um, you know, consequences to that particular participant. Um, in contrast, right? So other type of data, other type of information may not be sensitive or sensitive at all, right? So a person might have bad spatial perception. That is, a person, or can easily get lost. They cannot read a map. Of course, that information does not look good upon that individual. But even though that information might be released, the harm compared to this one might be less. So that's the meaning of this sentence, right? The actual risk depends on how sensitive the data are, because data are different. They concern different aspects of a person. So assume that or researchers are going to collect data that are rather sensitive. Then what should we do? As we said, researchers should propose, different ways to minimize the risk. For example, the best solution, of course, is to find ways to not collect data with identifiers. If you ask a question about people's illegal drug use, then don't ask about their name, don't ask about their physical address, don't ask about their current occupation. So once you don't collect those identifiers, then participants only exist in numbers. So even though they can tell researcher that they had ever used or they're actually using illegal drug, the risks will be minimized for the participants, because without names, without physical address, without occupation, without other individually identifiable information, the participants, in theory, cannot be identified. If you have a very strong reason to collect personally identifiable information, as well as sensitive data such as illegal drug use, um, then a typical practice that RB will demand is to remove, all those identifiable identifiers as soon as possible. That is, as soon as the function of the identifiers, such as names, are fulfilled. For example, um, it is very common for researchers to collect, I shouldn't say very common, but it is common, not uncommon, for researchers to collect names such that they can pay the subjects for participation, right? So in that sense, the function of collecting identifiers is for reward purposes. So the IRB will say, well, as soon as right after you pay the participants, that is right after the function of the identifiers is fulfilled, you should remove all those identifier identifiers permanently, so that other sensitive information about that participant will pose minimal risk to the participant if information is somehow leaked. Sometimes there are also reasons for researchers to be able to identify, or to distinguish participants from each other. For example, the study has two parts. That one part is a questionnaire. The second part is a measure of participants' height. So that means there must be a way for the researchers to link these two sections of data together, right? They have to match a person's height with their answers on a questionnaire. So in this case, identifiers must be preserved. In this case, then, the RB will demand typically that you do not use their names, do not use other individually identifiable information. Instead, you can create a code, right? A code can be a string of randomly generated numbers, and generate a code that's unique to each person, and use the code as a substitute or a surrogate identifier, and that should also be able to suffice the purpose of keeping identifiers, but without disclosing the true identity of the person. One last way to protect the unintentional leak of sensitive information is to report means or numbers that at an aggregate level. You do not report individual numbers, such as for example, on a question on illegal drug use, a particular participant reported that yes, I do use illegal drugs. So the participant circled a 7 on a 7-point scale, indicating that this person uses illegal drugs quite often. So this principle says then, in report, you don't report that score 7, right? Instead, you average all the scores on that question from all the participants, and you only report the average. In such a way, individual information is maxed, right? Or hidden in aggregated numbers. Another important safeguard practice is to use password protected account in your workstation computers, and this is especially important nowadays because much information or many data nowadays are stored in your computer, and it is paramount and very important that your computer is password protected because for obvious reasons, right? People can, if not if computer is not password protected, then other people theoretically can gain access to your files and then steal the data, including all the sensitive information, from you and your computer. So that's also bad. So you should maximize your security there. Lastly, if information is highly sensitive, and the reason to keep all the sensitive information, then lastly, as a last and important resort, is you should encrypt your data so that information is not easily accessed by non-related parties. However, there are some confidential data that researchers are legally compelled to report. That is, there are several classes of information, though personally identifiable, though sensitive, though personal, are not protected from research ethics. Such information includes child abuse. So if in a process of data collection, you learn about a particular participants has been the subject of child abuse, or that person is the perpetrator, then the researcher is required to report this instance to the appropriate authority. Another required reporting is if through data collection researcher becomes aware of a certain participant having specific communicable or infectious disease, then for public safety reasons, the researcher should report this particular information to appropriate authority. Or in the process of data collection, the researcher learns that there's intent from a particular participant either to harm him or herself or to harm others. Then this will also pose a security reason for researchers to report such personal and sensitive information. And of course, other kinds of abuse, right? Abuse the child, abuse the elderly, they should also be reported. And that's why in some consent forms, the IRB will require the participants to put a sentence that states, the data, shall be released when they're compelled by appropriate authorities, including the IRB and including law enforcement agencies. Okay, so this is one particular risk, the risk that involves personally identifiable information coupled with personal and sensitive information. Okay, all right, so this will be our 5th module on research ethics, and this will be the last module before our first exam. So first exam would include content or questions about this particular module. All right, see you next time.